As Queensryche, we're simply going on. We decided to go on and transition last year, after all. The original core members that initiated the entire thing were Betty and me. Scott Rockenfield is more than just a band's drummer. He is Queensryche's heartbeat, the snarling voice of the progressive metal age, and a drummer who narrates tales with each beat. Rockenfield was the one who made time for those cinematic fantasies when Queensryche transformed metal in the 1980s and 1990s with eerie concept albums. In addition to being strong, his sound had depth, feeling, and a narrative quality that very few drummers ever manage. Promised Land, Empire, Mindcrime, and Operation. His drumming brought every album to its zenith, making it a temple. However, that artist's life took a surprising turn. For his family, he once decided to leave the stage. However, he found out he had been kicked out of the band he co-founded when he attempted to rejoin. The dispute between Rockenfield and the other Queensryche members exposed the sour underbelly where trust, power, and fame no longer coexisted. This is more than just the tale of a drummer who was abandoned. It tells the tale of a guy, a parent, an artist, who courageously gave up something for love and then fought in private to get it back. From a modest upbringing to musical greatness, from iconic concept albums to a contentious court struggle, this movie will chronicle Scott Rockenfield's whole life. And lastly, the most significant query. How could a talent like that ever be overlooked? Childhood. On June 15, 1963, Scott Rockenfield was born in Seattle, Washington, a soggy city shrouded in rain and towering trees. On smoky stages are where musical dreams typically finish after starting in a garage. Scott came from a middle-class home and was the youngest of 3 children. Dennis Rockenfield, his father, was a Boeing technician who was modest, moral, and a silent advocate for his son's passion. Scott learned endurance and attention from his mother, Joan, a nurse who was kind but strong. There was not a single professional artist in the house. However, there was always music playing, whether it was from the kitchen radio or records by the Beatles, Chicago, or occasionally Elvis. Although neither of Scott's elder brothers studied music, they both had an impact on their younger brother through teasing, pretend drum fights on the couch, and arguments over who got to use the record player in the living room. Scott was the quietest person among all of that happy chatter, though. He was reticent and disliked crowds, although he could spend hours listening to Neil Peart or Tommy Aldridge's drumming on headphones. Christmas 1974 was a turning point in history. Scott's parents immediately gave him an inexpensive drum kit when he showed an interest in learning to play the instrument at the age of 11. Nobody could have predicted that this choice would lead to a whole new existence. After that, the garage behind the home turned into Scott's personal haven, where he practiced until his hands blistered, learned every beat and rhythm by instinct and ear, and used the drums to express everything that words could never. Scott didn't excel academically at Redmond High School, but his machine-like timing won over music teachers. Chris DeGarmo, a guitarist with a similar complicated and passionate musical mind to his own, became his friend there. Together, they created a band with the goal of creating a sound that was more avant-garde than hard rock at the time. More intelligent, deeper, more narratively focused. There was no traumatic family history or troubled upbringing. A rare gift was fostered by Scott Rockenfield's stable upbringing, which included silent love and support. He was not raised in hardship. He learned to be patient. And for that reason, he was a drummer who not only pounded hard but also directly tapped into the emotions of the audience. Early career in 1980, when many Seattle teenagers were still torn between disco and punk, 17-year-old Scott Rockenfield formed a garage band called Cross Plus Fire with classmates Eddie Jackson, Chris DeGarmo, and Michael Wilton. They studied music in addition to playing it. Every song was a rhythmic, harmonic, and structural conundrum. And Rockenfield was the one with the axis of all that intricacy. From the first riffs, the drummer exhibited discipline, organizational thinking, and a cinematic spirit. In 1982, the band changed their name to Queensryche, which sounded as strange and regal as the music they were making. They had previously gone by the Mob. Scott was more than just the drummer by this point. He was establishing the band's long-term goals, arranging, and helping with the stage graphics. For him, metal was more than simply music, it was the sound of a movie. The group chose to record and self-release a demo EP, Queensryche, 1983, in order to leave their mark. Rockenfield was the one who sent the recordings to nearby radio stations, organized the release, and suggested hiring a studio. The EP unexpectedly attracted a lot of attention, especially in the European market. Critics were astounded by Rockenfield's drumming on Queen of the Reich, not only because of his skill but also because of the manner he incorporated drum breaks into the story. Queensryche made their official entrance on the world of metal in 1984 with their debut album, The Warning. Although Iron Maiden's influence could still be heard on the record, their own sound was starting to emerge, particularly in their use of dramatic themes, sweeping melodies, and irregular time signatures, all of which were influenced by Rockenfield. He created enlarged drum kits, added lighting effects, and frequently thought of song transitions while performing live. The early success of Queensryche was not the result of following trends. They sought for a genre of metal that was both narrative and intellectually complex. And it was Rockenfield who contributed to making those concepts an oral reality. Each strike is a punctuation mark, and each drum beat is a chapter. Scott Rockenfield decided to narrate stories in a world full of ostentatious drummers. And for that reason, despite his lack of vocalization, he was acknowledged by the industry as the quiet genius behind one of the most brilliant bands of the 1980s. Professional achievement. The publication of Operation Mindcrime in 1988 marked the true turning point. It is still regarded by reviewers as one of the best concept albums in metal, a complicated, dark, intense, and political rock opera. However, for Scott Rockenfield, it was the point at which he transcended the traditional drummer's function and began using rhythm to convey stories. In Mindcrime, Rockenfield made space in addition to keeping time. His goal as a drummer was to evoke feelings rather than to brag. Every strike had a reason, whether it was the hammering urgency of Revolution Calling or the whispered tension in Sweet Sister Mary. In order to guarantee smooth transitions from discourse to instruments, he collaborated closely with Chris DeGarmo. In order to fully immerse the audience in a Mindcrime universe, Rockenfield also helped develop the sound effects and manage the lighting equipment during the tour. Both the band and the label were taken aback by the sudden popularity. Rockenfield, however, does not. "We weren't surprised," he once remarked, "because we had all spent a year living inside that album, in the studio, in our sleep, and in our own obsessions." Queensryche reached new heights in terms of commerce just 2 years later with Empire, 1990. DeGarmo's song Silent Lucidity became a worldwide smash. However, Rockenfield's subtle drumming prevented the song from getting cliched. He grounded the song and kept it from turning into a conventional pop ballad by using deep, sluggish rhythms that sounded almost like a sorrowful lullaby. A more experienced drummer who recognized that sometimes not playing is a form of playing was the source of that nuance. The band's intellectual depth was further demonstrated in 1994 with the album Promised Land, and Rockenfield started utilizing additional electronic instruments, such as programmed drums and stereospatial techniques, to improve the sound quality. Even as the music scene moved toward alternative and grunge, Queensryche managed to maintain its identity thanks to his unafraid experimentation. Rockenfield eventually established himself as a producing mainstay in addition to drumming. He created LED visuals, lighting effects, stage design for large tours, and even worked with others on video editing. Rockenfield was responsible for editing the transitions so that the songs flowed like a movie when the band began playing full album gigs. In addition to Queensryche, he started to expand. His career in cinematic music began in 1998 when he worked with filmmaker Paul Spear on the instrumental album with video, Televoid. His subsequent releases, Hell's Canyon 2000 and The X Chapters 2008, demonstrated his talent for creating emotionally charged and visually striking soundscapes. At the same time, he established Hollywood Loops, a business that specializes in background music and sound effects for movies, trailers, and video games. Trailers for RoboCop 2014, After Earth, and Call of Duty Black Ops have all used his work. At a period when many of his generation's metal drummers were only interested in performing, Rockenfield had developed into a sound designer, composer, and producer. His influence went well beyond that of a normal drummer because he was one of the few people who could communicate both backstage and on stage. Conflict and withdrawal. Scott Rockenfield abruptly announced a temporary departure from Queensryche in 2017 to take care of his family, just as the band was getting ready to start recording a new album. After his wife experienced difficulties following childbirth, Rockenfield, a new father, decided to focus on his family, which he felt was more essential than any career. Although Queensryche members voiced their support in the official statement, anger had already started to simmer behind those kind words. Although he continued to update his personal information on his own website, Rockenfield appeared to have been gradually pushed out of the band's orbit, and no one in the group made it apparent when he would return. When the verdict was made public in 2019, Scott still thought he was a member, he continued to get shares, and his name was still associated with the business, but not a single drum beat belonged to him. Rather, the percussion portion was played by lead vocalist Todd Latour, a choice that left supporters perplexed and Rockenfield feeling deceived. Rockenfield stated as much in a quick interview in 2021. Rockenfield formally sued the other two members, Eddie Jackson and Michael Wilton, in the Snohomish County Superior Court in Washington State on October 11, 2021. The lawsuit's contents made the band's backstage conflicts fully public. According to Rockenfield, he was kicked out of Queensryche Holdings Incorporated without permission. Profit payments had not been sent to him since 2017. He was denied authority over artistic direction, personnel choices, branding, and budgetary matters. In albums and tours, he was subtly and without appropriate permission replaced. Court filings claimed that Rockenfield sought restitution for his losses, the restoration of his rights, and the upholding of earlier contracts. Despite Queensryche's lack of public reaction, Wilton and Jackson repeatedly avoided bringing up Scott in subsequent interviews, acting as though he had never been a member of the band. Fans were divided during the nearly two-year-long court struggle. One side criticized Rockenfield for abandoning the band when they most needed him, while the other side supported him as someone banished from the very spiritual child he had assisted in creating. The litigation ended unexpectedly in December 2023. All claims and counterclaims were dismissed with prejudice after the parties struck a settlement outside of trial, according to court documents, implying that the case could not be reopened by either party. A phase in Queensryche's history that no one wanted to relive ended with a chilly line in the Washington state court system: no press conference, no farewell, and no words from any of the three members. For Scott Rockenfield, it was more than just money or celebrity. It was a deep loss in the sense of abandonment from something he had dedicated more than 30 years of his life to. The stage is not necessary. I must be respected. Following the conclusion of the lawsuit, he wrote a brief, icy, yet eerie message on his own website. Private life. Publicizing his private life has never been Scott Rockenfield's style. Scott stayed silent on social media while other drummers of his generation posted images of their children, vehicles, studios, or lavish trips. And maybe his true nature as an artist who values depth above flair is reflected in that very stillness. There is very little information available about his family. All that is known is that his wife had difficult childbirth in 2017 and that their newborn needed extra attention. Scott left the band without a second thought. Many in the industry referred to this as the most audacious and isolated move, because a drummer who takes a hiatus runs the risk of being forgotten from the history he helped create, rather than simply leaving the stage. Scott hasn't been spotted at any concerts, music festivals, or fan gatherings since. He has virtually disappeared from the public consciousness. Only articles regarding drumming techniques or little cinematic music projects are mentioned in the few updates on his own website. No images of children, no family stories, not even a "I'm fine" status. At first, that quiet sparked suspicion. People assumed that he might be retreating or bitter for private, undisclosed reasons. However, it became evident that Rockenfield wasn't sleeping during that period when the complaint appeared. He was battling not just in courtrooms but also within himself between duty and passion, celebrity and family. His decision to choose family came at a greater cost than benefit. However, from a father's perspective, he might have been the only person in Queensryche at the time who was actually adhering to the lessons that Mindcrime had taught: decision-making, accountability, and the cost of faith. The name of his wife is unknown. Nobody is aware of that child's development. Perhaps that's the point, though. Rockenfield never employed his family as a publicity tool or a shield. He kept them safe while he was away. Absence can also be a peaceful, complete kind of love at times. Legacy and influence. Scott Rockenfield broke the misconception that drummers are the timekeepers in the back of the room. He led, not merely kept time. He used the drums to tell stories in addition to playing them. Rockenfield produced Sonic Space and Operation, Mindcrime, and Promised Land, where each drum stroke was skillfully constructed as a component of an emotional architecture, rather than merely rhythm. Rockenfield took a different route, not being as flashy as Tommy Lee or as mechanically technical as Mike Portnoy. Story depth, cinematic texture, and emotion. He was one of the few drummers who could tell a tale with rhythm. The drums in Revolution Calling sounded like the sound of an uprising. Every beat of silent lucidity felt like a melancholy lullaby. Additionally, he defied convention with IMI by constructing a sonically visual world, which has served as an inspiration for other contemporary metal bands, including Tool, Mastodon, and Dream Theater. Scott Rockenfield was ranked 39th on Rolling Stone's 2016 list of the 100 greatest drummers of all time. It's a modest figure, but it's appropriate given that his legacy is one of invention rather than celebrity. He was the one who demonstrated that metal could be intellectually stimulating and that drums could elicit thought in addition to excitement. Rockenfield's impact went beyond music to include sound design for motion pictures. He provided hundreds of sound effects and background music for popular action movies, video games, and trailers through his business Hollywood Loops. He retained his rock identity despite switching from live drumming to sound design. Only one thing was confirmed: he was ahead of his time all the time. His lifestyle and work were a statement unto themselves. No celebrity, no scandals, no microphone required, just a sound that is strong enough to survive its creator. Deeper down, Scott Rockenfield's biggest contribution isn't just the sound of drumming. It's a reinterpretation of devotion. A career that never sought attention, yet is still irreplaceable. A musician who left the band but never abandoned the music. Current circumstances. Scott Rockenfield went into a protracted period of silence following the formal conclusion of the litigation with the remaining Queensryche members at the end of 2023. No declarations, no brand new musical endeavors, and no participation in any significant music events. As though he had decided to turn off his own drums, the guy who had once made time for huge albums like Mindcrime and Empire had now disappeared from the rock world's mainstream. Silence, however, does not imply the end. As 2024 approached, Rockenfield made a cautious and gradual comeback. A brief message on his personal Facebook page was the first step. However, the message served as a reminder that he was still active, still working, and had never really given up on music. When Rockenfield made an unexpected appearance at the screening of the independent horror movie Beginning of the End in the middle of 2025, many were taken aback. In addition to being seated among the invited guests, he participated in the Q&A session with the producers and director on stage, disclosing that he had contributed to the post-production or music for the movie. Given his experience with Hollywood loops and sound design, a move toward filmmaking wasn't shocking. However, this was the first occasion that fans had saw him take the stage again in almost 10 years. Nevertheless, everything stayed subdued, silent, and uncommercial. Queensryche was not mentioned by him. There were no names, no complaints, and no remarks on rock music. That whole chapter seemed to have been meticulously sealed, discreetly hidden in one of his own drawers. A true artist, so the saying goes, never has to announce a return since they never really go away. That might apply to Rockenfield. He didn't ever say goodbye. He just made the decision to live in a different way, with a more subdued, artistic depth rather than with drum sounds. Furthermore, it won't be a comeback if Scott's drums are ever heard again in a movie, soundtrack, or independent album. He never stopped playing, and this will only be the next beat in his journey. It was never Scott Rockenfield's style to seek attention. To get attention, he didn't scream or bleed over his drums. Despite being in the rear, he got the entire band to move to his beat. From a self-taught youngster honing his skills in a Seattle garage to designing the soundscape for one of the best progressive metal albums, Rockenfield consistently opted for the more difficult, in-depth path. Less noisy. Like a director of a movie, he created melodic spaces. He used seemingly straightforward but well-considered drum beats to evoke strong feelings in his audience. And he took a step back when it was time. It was a decision, not a defeat. He stayed in Queensryche. They took him out of it. There was silence, no greeting, no announcement. But his biggest statement was that silence. To demonstrate his presence, an artist does not have to revolt. Every time the drums make a distinct sound, others may sense his absence. Many people think of Scott Rockenfield as Queensryche's former drummer. He is the soul of an era, a storyteller without words, a parent who chose family at his height, according to those who endured Mindcrime, shook an empire, and became motionless during the slow pulse of silent lucidity. An artist who deserves fair recognition without having to be lamented. Additionally, if you listen intently enough, you may still be able to hear him. In the precise silence he left behind, in a beat that infiltrates a movie scene, in a straightforward loop that speaks directly to the heart. Scott Rockenfield is the individual who decided to keep quiet in order to preserve his own drumming sound. Perhaps Scott Rockenfield's drums were the reason why a Queensryche song ever resonated with you on a deep level. Comment in the space provided below. What song most makes you think of him? Is love not real to me? Or am I calling for revolution? Remember to hit the bell, like, and subscribe because we will continue to share the tales of the unsung heroes, the people who once made rock quake before disappearing into the music they crafted. I'll see you in the upcoming video.